Mark, pronouns he, him, calling him from New York, says that human beings are more than animals. Mark, how are you doing today?
Hey, man, how's it going?
It's going really well, dude.
So if I could just pick up on... Good. I like the show so far. Really interesting. Good callers.
Thank you.
I wanted to pick up on the last question I think you asked the gentleman who was just on, and I'm not sure if I fully caught the question correctly, but I would posit that if I understood the question correctly, I would posit when it comes to something like, does somebody love you, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're asking yourself that question, how would you ever establish the answer to that question? You're going to base it in part on evidence, based on how they act towards you, your relationship with that person. But essentially, you're never going to have a definitive answer. It's not a scientific question that you can answer definitively. And so you're going to be going on faith, essentially.
No,
but that is going to be...
You don't have access to people's mental states.
Evidence-based.
You don't have access to people's mental states.
I'm sorry?
I don't know why that's... You don't have access to people's mental states. I don't know why. Like, of course you don't.
Yeah, I would draw...
You have a background. It doesn't mean you have to have certainty. I don't know why that would be required. It's not like once,
I think
once
that's
you're like not a little certain that all of a sudden faith gets snuck in there. You have a background information that you're going off of, so it wouldn't be faith. Faith doesn't require background information. It just requires the trust in the proposition to be true. That's it. If you add stuff to that, it's no longer faith. Once you add stuff to that, it's no longer faith. You're giving reasons for why you believe.
Well, I think it's just right. Maybe I misunderstood the question, but when you're referring to something like you said, like what's inside someone's heart, what's inside someone's mind, you're saying that there's no element in having faith in the outcome of what that might be?
It's not about faith. It's about... Sorry.
I was just going to say, like,
be clear
go ahead.
There's a background information set that's there. I'm not pulling it out of, I just really trust that Forrest loves me, right? Like, it would be based on whether or not we've had a relationship. There's things that he's done for me, and they've expressed to me that that's what they do when they show people love, right? All these stuff, like, it's not like it's just, I believe the proposition and I really just trust it without reasons or justification. That's like totally divorced from that, in my opinion, but maybe Forrest has a different opinion on that.
Yeah, I would say that it's kind of stretching the word faith quite a bit to say that, because, like, you know, as you pointed out, faith is something that has no evidence. It's completely just trust based. And, like, for me, it's like when people say, you know, you have faith in science or something like that. You know, I have my cell phone here. If I drop it, I don't have faith in gravity. I don't have faith that it's going to fall at 9.81 meters per second squared. I have repeated testable evidence from the past, and I can apply that to the future. So I have reasonable expectations. You could even maybe use the word trust. You know, I have a reasonable expectation of the normal force. That's why I'm not falling through my chair at this moment. So I have reasonable expectation. I have a trust that my wife loves me because of the things that she does, because of the things that she says, because I believe she tells me the truth. She doesn't lie to me. And so when she tells me she loves me, I assume she's telling me the truth then as well. She doesn't have a motive to lie about that. She doesn't gain anything from lying to me about that. It would make her life exponentially worse to just say that she loves me and be in a relationship with me when she doesn't. She could be out with somebody that she does love. What a stupid thing for her to do. Like that. There's a million reasons why I can say I have a reasonable, you know, belief, a justified expectation in that. I think it's a big stretch to call that faith.
Okay, well then I think the distinction is we're using the word faith differently, because I'm a skeptical person. I've been agnostic and atheist for a good chunk of my life. And what has brought me over into the theist camp, so to speak, is not blind faith. It's not a desire to just wish that was the case. I've looked at the evidence, I looked at the arguments, and I concluded that although I don't know for certain that it is more probable that God exists, and I base that on the evidence. Just like you point to things like when you mentioned,
what's the evidence?
What is the evidence?
Yeah, we've done a show for 20 years asking this question.
Okay, I wrote down a list of things here that I would say, and I would almost put it in the reverse, which is atheism fails to provide an adoquate explanation for the following things. I wrote down the contingent existence of the universe.
Hold on.
Sorry, hold on.
How does atheism...
Yeah, you've already. I'm sorry to say, I don't mean to cut you off. I apologize, but you've already blown it if that's what you're starting with, because atheism isn't an explanatory device. Atheism is simply the position on one single question: do you believe in a God? And we say no. So, like, we're not providing explanations on anything. We're not trying to explain. That's not what we're here for. If I tell you there's an elephant sitting behind these bookshelves, you can say yes, there is, or you can say no, there isn't, or you can say I don't believe you. If you say yes, there is, or no, there isn't, you need evidence for that. But if you just say I don't believe you, then you're just waiting on me to give you evidence.
Yeah,
and that's what we're doing with God. We're not saying there is no God. We're saying we don't believe there is one because we have no reason to think there is. That there's nothing else beyond that in atheism. If you want to talk about science, sure, but that's not what we're here for.
If you bring up evidence, or if you're talking about evidence and the first thing out of your mouth is about atheists, what you're saying is like, well, there's these people that believe, like, if me in my position, if you start out with you for the reasons why you believe, you've already shot yourself in the foot completely, because I have nothing to do with what the evidence is, or why you believe, or why you think you're justified. So atheism wouldn't have to do with that. If you're going to go into a worldview comparison, then I'm just taking that as an abductive method. You're saying what's most likely the case, but that's going to fail very quickly, right? Because you have a lot of extra stuff in there that's probably not going to be told if you're a Christian. We haven't heard anything about the incarnation, the Trinity, angels, eternal angel demon wars, like all this extra stuff, just per Occam's razor or like parsimony. We can just shave all that shit off, right? So I don't really know, like, if we're going to go into the worldview comparative notion, it's going to be clearly favored towards naturalism, right? Because we want to add all this extra stuff.
That's what I'm taking issue with. And maybe I shouldn't have said atheism. Maybe I should have said like material naturalism or something like that, because that's what you have. I mean, each of our worldviews.
No, your evidence is you. I'm going to cut you off. I'm sorry, Mark. I'm going to cut you off every time you do this. You have evidence. Me being a materialist, me being a property dualist, me being an idealist has nothing to do with the evidence of why God exists, right? I could just imagine I'd like died, right? I'm dead. Now give the evidence, or all atheists are gone, right? What's the evidence? That's not going to all of a sudden do anything to change the view, right? So what's the evidence? If you talk about atheist or materialist or naturalist, I'm just going to cut you off because you've already messed up. It's your view. This has nothing to do with your view.
No, I understand that. And when in answering that question, there's only a couple of different ways you could go about answering it. One is you could say something like God is directly experienced by the person, and that gives them a basis to believe, right? But the atheist wants more.
Cross that one off. What's the next one?
They don't want to.
I don't believe that.
That doesn't work for us. So what's the next one?
What's the next one? That one's clearly false.
So what? Okay, I would then argue is the closest thing to something empirical, I would say, from a historical perspective or historical evidence, is the life and resurrection of Jesus. And you could have that debate back and forth about whether.
Yeah, I do. I take a very specific position on this. Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher, right? Mark 9:1, Mark 13:30. In our earliest traditions in Mark, we get a very heavily apocalyptic message that's multiply attested in Mark, M, L, and Q. And then in Luke and John, we get a de-emphasizing of this apocalyptic message, where the kingdom of God is no longer supposed to be this like thing that's supposed to happen in the disciples' lifetime. Truly, I tell you, none of you here will be standing here will taste death before you see the kingdom of God come in power, right? That gets changed and muted in Luke, where now it's not something that will be seen or observed. Luke 17:20-21, if you're interested. And the whole point of this is my view on Jesus. There's really no convincing me that he resurrected or anything or predicted his death, because everything that I take as the historical Jesus, which I do accept exists, all of that shows a first century Palestinian apocalyptic message that he thinks was going to happen during his time. And it didn't happen. And so for me, I can conclude Christianity is pretty clearly false. So like the resurrection is not going to help in any way. It's because it's not even a historical fact, right? So I don't know what you're basing it off of just to say this book says this thing. My view is going to be based on very specific historical criterions that what I think shows good reason why Christianity is false. So the resurrection is going to be a non-starter, at least for me, maybe Forrest, but I just completely think that's garbage.
It's definitely a non-starter for me as well, because like that's the thing about these Bible stories is that you have this whole body of claims here in the Bible, And if you can prove one of them, that nothing the rest of them. So even if you can prove the resurrection of Jesus, wow, radical. You have a guy who rose from the dead in 3 days. People come back from the dead in hospitals all the time, but hey, man, it happened this time, and it took a really long time to do it. Incredible, cool. You haven't proven that he did any other miracles. You haven't proven that he was the Son of God. You haven't proven that there's a God for him to be the son of. You haven't proven any of the claims about the future that he made. You haven't proven anything else besides the fact that this dude came back from the dead and his name happened to be Jesus. Like that does nothing for me.
Well, what I would say to that is that what you would be dealing here is not with the resurrection really of any person. This is a resurrection of somebody who spoke really with an unparalleled authority, that he was speaking with a divine nature. And so if that person was resurrected, I think it is completely different. And I would challenge. I would say this: if you gentlemen think Jesus existed, I would ask you to look at whether the crucifixion happened.
I accept it. Yeah, I accept it. I do. No, I already accept it. I already accept the crucifixion likely happened. Okay, I agree with pretty basic facts. I agree. He was probably betrayed by Judas Iscariot. That passes the criterion of dissimilarity. It's not something Christians would want to have shown, that Jesus didn't have authority over somebody, right? It's dissimilar to what early Christians would want. And so we can use these criterions. The three that I'm talking about are independent attestation, the criterion of dissimilarity, and contextual credibility. And those are really important. My view on this, it's not like my view. It's a pretty common non-Christian, or even depending on, some Christians go down a different view called preterism. That's a whole separate topic. But the majority, like a pretty majority scholar view, or at least it's not a fringe view, is what I'm expressing. And the reason why it's important is when I look at the Bible or I look at Jesus, it's not enough for you to cite like proof text of verses that say, the Son of Man needs to go to Jerusalem to die and raise in 3 days, right? Because those are the things I'm going to contest. I'm going to say, I accept Jesus existed. I accept he was crucified. I accept these things. But the reason that I accept what Jesus likely said in Mark 9:1 and Mark 13:30 has to do with the fact that it's our earliest traditions. They pass dissimilarity. It's not something Christians would want to make up. The early part of his ministry is with an apocalyptic preacher, John the Baptist. The later end of it, after he dies, has Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15 expressing that he thinks it's going to happen in his lifetime. And so for me, when I look at all of those historical facts, I say, well, what's the key to the middle? Well, it's clearly that it was an apocalyptic message, and it wasn't something that was supposed to concern people 2,000 years from now. It was something that was supposed to happen right now. And that passes contextual credibility, because we know that Jews at the time during the intertestamental period were being like, it was the Babylonians, the Assyrians, Ptolemaics, Succlitic kings, right? All of these people just oppressing them. And so the entire message through that intertestamental period was, hold on a little longer. Just hold on a little longer, because soon enough, the powers of evil will be overthrown and God's kingdom will come. And so when Jesus expresses that in, first century Palestine, it completely fits the historical data. And so my thing is that Jesus, in the historical context, is one of the best ways to show that Christianity is not true. And so if we're going to have a conversation about it, I need people who want to have this discussion to invoke historical criterions. Otherwise, they can just pull out any verse that they want, right? And so that's the problem I have, is I don't think Christians really do this.
That's right. I actually agree with that, and I would say that there was no concept of a Jewish Messiah that was crucified and rose again. That's not a Jewish belief, and so and I think from a historical perspective, you sort of have this. You have sort of historians and scholars of the New Testament who will agree on certain facts, but they just, I think methodology limits them in terms of taking the next step and saying he was resurrected, because they're kind of confined.
There's a reason why. Well, that's but that's look. The reason why historians don't appeal to miracles in anything, right? Just think about what the scope of history is. It's an abductive method. meaning that it's trying to find out what's most
Right.
probable. What is the resurrection? Isn't that by definition something that's not likely to occur, very improbable of an event? So it just lays outside the scope of what abductive methodology entails, which is we want to figure out what's most likely probable. You can't take the most improbable thing that you're defining as the most likely thing from the historical context. That's why scholars who do believe in this admit that they have to take it on faith. They can't take it from a historical account unless you want to go with the minimal facts argument, which doesn't show anything, right? That just is a Greg and grant every one of those, and it doesn't get you to a bodily resurrection or even it being more
have a
probable.
slightly different line of questioning for Mark really quickly, because we're very quickly running out of time. And I just want to ask, because like you've hit the nail on the head 17 different times here, J Mike, but I just want to make sure I like to give a more concrete thing. You know, we're talking these miracles of the Bible, the 2,000 years old, and now we have the translation of the reinterpretation of the 15 of the new translation thing from a long time ago. And there's a lot of questions here that we can ask, but I wonder if you've heard about Sai Baba. He was a healer. He was he lived in India in 2011. So he lived from 1926 to 2011. And he did incredible things. Like we can look up the miracles that he performed. He did spiritual healing. He healed people. He was able to produce rings and necklaces and watches from ashes. He was able to light candles with water. It says here that he resurrected people. He was capable of clairvoyance. He was able to see the future. There are countless. You can go on his website here. There are still people today saying that he's come to them in dreams and saved them from danger, that he has healed their sickness and their pain because they prayed to him. This is a man who lived in our lifetime that apparently did all these things. He has millions of followers online, and in India, he had millions of people show up to his funeral. Like this guy is all over the place, and he's done all these incredible miracles. And he himself said he was a reincarnation of another great healer named something else, Sai Baba. So like, why don't you believe in this dude when we have pictures of him and we have millions of people who saw that he resurrected somebody, but you do believe in 1,000-year-old book that said some dude did some.
Can you hear me? Sorry, I
Yeah.
sounded like it cut out for a sec.
Yeah.
I have heard of that gentleman. I mean, I heard of him. I'm not extremely familiar with him. I mean, I think you have to answer that question objectively. I mean, I'm a skeptical person, and so I take each case separately. And when I look at the topic we were just discussing about Jesus, it's within a larger framework where I start with this idea that there is a God, and then I kind of work from there.
And so maybe if you were born in India, believe that this guy might be real, then you believe in him, right?
If there was, I mean, again, if there was evidence, I would look at.
There's millions of people who say it happened.
Yeah, there were pretty. If I'm not mistaken, there was like some really smart. There was, if I'm not mistaken, no, there was. I have to go back and look, but I'm pretty sure there was like people that were highly educated, even from like the U.S., that were going over there because they believed what was being expressed. Right? We don't have any evidence for the claim that Sai Baba was doing what was being claimed. Right? We don't have that, but you wouldn't take the story on it, right? You wouldn't accept that. And to Forrest's point, that has let's just say it's 100,000 people or something, right? I mean, it has significance. I don't know what would be different, except we're actually somewhat, we're not 2,000 years removed from it, right?
Right.
So
I believe in this book that's 2,000 years old because you were born in a society where it's normal to believe in this book. You were raised around Christians, people who believed in this stuff. You were probably taught this as a kid. And now look at you. You believe it. You're so lucky that out of the 8 billion people on the planet, you were born in the right country, in the right area of the country, with the right family who believed in the right version of the right religion, that you now know the actual truth. However, here are millions and millions of people who believe something very different about a guy who just existed a few years ago. Why is it not relevant to you? Why don't you know that much about this guy that you think you've heard of him, but you're not sure? Why isn't this the biggest story in your world right now, that this dude did all the things that Jesus did, and somehow he's not even a blip on your radar?
With no mythicists, by the way.
That's true.
Well, but one thing I would take issue, and you know, I take your point, but what I would take issue with is, and I think atheists have this misunderstanding that the theist is sort of putting the cart before the horse. Like they're starting with
Mark, how is this answering
they were
for
born
us?
that way.
I'm getting mildly frustrated. Like, I don't know how this is answering what he was saying, what he asked you.
I thought I had answered that by saying each claim I would have to examine the evidence for the claim. I mean, I don't know how
So
else
when I said that a minute ago about Jesus, you said the resurrection is proof of all the other things, and I said no, the resurrection, even if you could prove that, is just one thing and doesn't say anything else. And you said, yeah, but if Jesus is actually this guy speaking with such authority, then that means the resurrection is actually proof of all this other stuff. So why don't we do this here? If you could prove that Sai Baba was this awesome person, he said a lot of amazing things and spoke with great authority. Millions of people, you know, really had their lives changed by him.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you apply the same line of thinking to him that you are doing for Jesus here?
Well, I think I was mentioning why Jesus was, when I said he was speaking with the authority, I was trying to describe why I think that holistically that story makes sense on some level. You don't have to buy it, you know, but there's sort of a holistic nature to that story. This person you're talking about in India is a totally separate case. I'm not, you know, familiar with it enough to opine on it. It doesn't sound.
The woman in adultery is a good story, right? The woman in adultery is a good story. Guess what? That's in the latest like manuscripts that we have, right? Scholars agree that that doesn't go back to anything with Jesus, right? So this is the whole important point about like you can pick things out, right? But like I'm going to come back with the historical basis that I mean, you can appeal to some story, but I mean, I just don't get why anybody should someone should care about that when it suffers
what about Socrates?
Historical issues, and we don't have the historical issue suffering in the case that Forrest presented, right?
What about Socrates? Socrates, there's no reason to actually existed. He was probably just a character made up by Plato just to tell stories. And yet we have the Socratic method. Socrates is the basis of a lot of modern philosophy. It doesn't matter that he existed or not because he has all these amazing stories, these amazing ideas, these amazing lectures that he supposedly gave that we wrote down about. Do you believe in Socrates? Does it matter? Or is it just a story you can draw something?
And I like philosophy, and I'm like, it doesn't affect me. It doesn't matter. Doesn't make it true.
I think, you know, the historicity of each of these individuals has to be independently established. And yeah, I think truth matters. I don't think we should just believe things because they tell a nice story. I mean, I want to know what's true. That's what's motivating me.
Right.
You know, so I think having these conversations, I think, are helpful because at least we're able to test each other. If you're just in an echo chamber and you're not testing your own theories and reasons, you know, you're kind of, I think ultimately, like, you're very likely to fall into the trap of believing something that isn't true. I just, you know, I mentioned Jesus because you guys you want something tangible. And when the caller gives something like an abductive line of reasoning, there's kind of pushback, like, well, we don't, you know, it seems like the very common response is like, we just don't know. And
no, I gave a very specific, I gave a very specific pushback, right? Like I've looked into, like, if you want to have a conversation we can't because we're running up to the end of the show, but if you want to call back and we have this conversation, I can list out all the reasons. I'm not going to just appeal to what like scholars say. We can do this together. We can like look at this ourselves and go through, because my response back to you about the Jesus thing was, we need to look at the historical context of these verses. We can't just cite this verse and go, that's what happened, or that's on the lips of Jesus. The whole important point is what words were put on the lips of Jesus versus ones we can be reasonably confident that he expressed somewhat like. And from my view, we do have a pretty good criterion, like I gave, independent attestation or dissimilarity, and we can go back and we can look and we can go, wow, okay, it passes all of these. So we have a higher probability that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher who was talking about the end times in his lifetime, and it didn't occur. And so I mean, we could just give an argument. Like, I could just render an argument now. If Christianity is true, then the kingdom of heaven would have been established during the disciples' lifetime, as per Mark 9:1 and Mark 13:30. It is not the case that the kingdom of heaven was established during the disciples' lifetime. Conclusion: Christianity is false, right? And I'm going to give you the historical evidence on why I think that's the best abductive case. If you just come back to me and saying, well, it says this verse or it's nice there, my first question to you is, okay, does it pass these historical criterions? Do we have a good reason to think that these were actually the words of Jesus or part of his ministry versus what later Christians or scribes had theological reasons to insert in, right? To deal with community issues at the time. Because that's the evidence. The evidence shows.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I agree with that. It does have to pass the historical muster, and I think that the burden on the person arguing against the resurrection is to explain how the burial grounds were found empty, how the disciples had experiences of the risen Jesus, and then the origin of their belief.
It's probably a good idea that they explain why each one of the different books has a different account of finding that thing empty, whether it was, one woman or two women or 1,000 women, and if they told nobody or if they told a bunch of people, and if they saw him rise in the air, if they saw him in the thing, and one of them had a ham sandwich. Like, there's a million different accounts of the same event.
One said stay in Jerusalem for 40 days, one didn't, right? So one's at the resurrection. Wait, but just when did it happen? Did it happen in like John's account where he has a theological reason to make it during the slaughtering of the lambs to show a metaphorical and symbolic notion that Jesus is the Lamb of God who died for our sins? Or do you think that the account that I think it's Mark or Matthew that has it prior, right, to the Passover, right? They're both in different times. You couldn't look at the resurrection accounts and have reasonable expectation for the events, let alone the outcome that we're just supposing is true. But I mean, to me, it just seems like an issue.
I would agree there are differences. I think there are differences in the accounts, but I think for the essence of the accounts, there's sort of a common thread among.
If I give you a map, and it says my house is here, and then another map I give you says it's in a different location, which one's reliable, and how do we know?
Well, if I say you live in New York, and yet, what does that mean? Does that mean the Bronx? Does that mean Long Island?
Yeah, let's say Georgia or New York.
Because I do live in New York.
Yeah, I think Georgia or New York. I think there's differences, there's huge differences in our manuscripts, or in the gospel accounts themselves, that it would be like me handing you a map of that I live in Florida versus a map that I live in Georgia. Right? They're not the same. They can't reconcile them. And so the question is, which one should we accept before we can even talk about whether or not the resurrection is even is something we should consider? We need to know how do we even know which account's reliable? What are we even going off of?
Well, look, you raise good questions. I'm not a biblical scholar, by any means, but again, when it comes to my personal faith, that I look to science, I look to philosophy, metaphysics, as sort of that's where I start from, and I
look at philosophy and metaphysics too, and I don't see it. I don't know that that's.
Well, I hope.
Yeah, I don't think that's monopolized by theists.
I remain open to changing my mind. So I feel in like just the sort of instinctually that there has to be a God. That could be wrong. That could just be, a belief that's just misguided. So I kind of I'm sort of fighting against that internal, swimming upstream, so to speak, on some level. But I do try to remain objective. And, it just seems to me that there's when you look at sort of all the interconnected issues from morality to consciousness to the origin of life, it's literally endless. Like, why does mathematics?
And there's philosophical views that are naturalistic views that completely contain all of those issues, right? There's thousands of years of Western thought, of philosophical thought, that whether that might be valuable to somebody or not, there's answers to those things. It's not. What I was saying a second ago. It's not monopolized to theism. It's not.
Yeah,
And I'd argue
No,
theism
it's
entails
certainly not. I mean, I
subjective
think,
morality anyway, but that's a whole other conversation.
yeah, no, I actually agree with it. I mean, I think there's good arguments on both sides. Where I get lost a little bit is when a lot of times you hear the atheists say, like, there's no evidence, there's no arguments that lead me to think
about it though. I mean, we
and
asked you.
that's where
We asked you for evidence, and we didn't get any, and that's kind of to the frustration of the atheists. They'll ask, and they don't get anything that seems to be.
We also gave you the exact same evidence that you gave us about a different person, and you just kind of dismissed him out of hand. So, like, you understand where we're coming from now? The same reason why you don't believe in every other possible God is why we don't believe in yours. The same evidence that applies to every other religion, every other belief, also applies to yours. And you're giving us the exact same arguments that we get from Muslim people and from Hindu people and from every other religion under the sun. And they all don't work the exact same way. So there's no, like you said, there's good arguments on both sides. I don't agree with you. I think that there is, here's evidence for this thing. Here is not evidence for this thing. Pick which one matters. And as long as you care that what you believe in is true, then you're going to have to be honest and just say, I don't have evidence for this, so there's no reason for me to believe it.
Yeah, a good argument would entail like a valid, sound argument with the conclusion that generates God exists. And I don't think that argument has been put forth, at least yet.
Anyway, Mark, we've been going for a long time, for about 30 minutes. I wanted to hear why human beings are more than just animals, but we're way past the point where we could get to that. But we've got to let you go because we're out running overtime. We got to end the show because people got things to do. But I appreciate you calling in. Please call again if you want to talk about this more. If you want to tell me why you think a human is not an animal, I'd love to hear it. That's my whole business.